To commemorate the 140th anniversary of the launch of Amateur Photographer magazine, we decided to look back at the landmark cameras, the classic cameras that have the history of photography, basically, because Amateur Photographer launched just 30 or so years after photography was pretty much invented. And I'm with John Wade, our classic cameras expert, and we're going to talk you through all the classic cameras from the very earliest days right up until the end of the 20th century, pretty much. That's a lot of cameras, so we're going to split this into a series of videos. And in this first one, we're going to start at the beginning. So, John, just talk us through the very early days. We're talking about the 19th century Victorian era.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about AP, which was in 1884, which really was a good place to start because it was a time when it was becoming easier to be a photographer, and there was more and more amateurs coming into it. In fact, in that very first issue of AP, the editor said there are now more amateur photographers in the country than there are professionals.
That's right. So, that's still the case.
Yeah. So that's where I'm going to start, but we ought to look back a little bit and very, very briefly about how we got to that point. What has come to be acknowledged as the first photograph was taken by a Frenchman called Joseph Nicoporet, Niepce or Niepce. Nobody really knows which way to call it, but we'll call it.
I call him Niepce.
We'll call him Niepce.
You call him Niepce if you will.
And likewise, nobody's really sure when you actually took the picture. Many people say 1826, some people say it's 1827, so it's one of those two.
Currently, we're saying 1824 because there's a lot of stuff around saying it's a 200th anniversary.
He did actually.
There's proof of that, though.
No, but it looks like he actually did something in 1824 and communicated.
He wrote to his brother, didn't he, and said, "Hey, I've invented the photograph."
That's it.
There is no evidence.
So let's have a look at it. But in 1826/27, he took what is acknowledged as the world's first photograph.
It still exists.
Yeah, it still exists. Was the first photograph by a totally impractical process, which we won't go into, but it involved using something called bitumen of Judea, and coating it onto a pewter plate, and the exposure was 8 hours. It was totally impractical. But it was the sort of start. Where photography really started was in 1839 with a gentleman, another Frenchman called Jacques-Louis Mandé Daguerre, who produced the daguerreotype process. And again, we could spend the rest of the day talking about how that worked. It was quite complicated, and it was very dangerous because it involved heating mercury and heating iodine fumes and all sorts of things. And it produced direct positives onto silver-plated copper. And it was very, very popular, mostly for portraiture. The next landmark came the very next year with our very own William Henry Fox Talbot, an Englishman, squire of the manor at Laycock. And he was the first man to acknowledge it'd be a good idea not to produce a direct positive, to produce a negative first. And he produced it with a process called the colour-type process. And he produced negatives on paper, which then contact printed to make a positive. And so he was the first man to show if you made a negative first, you could then make a lot of...
So the photographic process that actually took off was based on Fox Talbot.
Yes.
Rather than
absolutely. And that's why he's very often known as the father of photography, even though he didn't invent it as such. It got better with the introduction of glass plates. Images became sharper.
The texture of the paper was a problem, wasn't it?
It was indeed. It's quite a charming look to the pictures. But glass plates, the first ones came from something called the wet plate process, and that involved actually making a plate immediately prior to exposure, exposing it in the camera while still wet, and then processing it immediately after, which is great if you're in a studio and you've got the darkroom next door, but there were photographers who went out taking landscapes or whatever, and they took portable darkrooms with them. In fact, Roger Fenton toured the Crimean War scenes in a horse and cart, which had a portable darkroom in it. So that was the wet plate process, very popular, not so easy to use, but it really got things going. But the real turning point, of course, was when it went to dry plates. And these you could buy in advance.
Pre-coated already and dried and sealed in a packet. Yeah.
Absolutely. Take them out of the packet, put them in the camera, use them, put them away, process them later.
I like film in a sheet form.
Absolutely, absolutely. So that really was, I suppose, it wasn't the start of photography, but it was the start of popular photography, let's put it. And that would have taken us into an era around about the middle to late 1800s when cameras would have looked like this. This is a camera which is unmarked, but I have reason to believe that it was called the Earl and might have been made by a British company called the Royalty Camera Company.
Okay.
But I'm not actually.
So this is the kind of camera that would have been around when AP was launched, and the kind of cameras that the very first readers of AP, and indeed the staff, the editor and so forth,
Yes,
would have been using these cameras.
absolutely. So it used dry plates in the back. You would have focused on the ground glass screen. You would have then taken it aside, put a plate holder in there, closed by which time you would have closed the shutter, taken out a dark slide which exposes the plate to the film, take off the lens cap, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, put it back on again, put the dark slide back in again, take the film holder out, and keep it for later development in a dark room. But that's the sort of camera. It's little more, as you can see, than a lens on a panel at the front, linked to another box at the back, into which you can put your plate, and linked by bellows for focusing. Shortly after this, shutters began to become popular, but we won't go into all of that. So, as I say, on the 10th of October, 1884, when the first AP was produced, this is the sort of camera which people would have been using. The next major landmark, I guess, after that...
Can I have a look at it?
Yes, let's talk about it. Yeah,
let's have a look before we go.
Yeah.
Well, it says on the back, a royalty camera's the Earl. Yeah. Nice.
I mean, that particular model is pretty certain to be pre-1900 at least, because it's noticed that the bellows are square on the edges.
Right.
Around about 1900, they chamfered them.
Did that? Okay.
At the edges, and that's really how you can tell. One of the ways you can tell the age of a camera.
Is it? That's interesting. Why was that? Is that because they last longer? Because I
think so. I mean, it's very easy to
leaks like these.
To get a hole in that way, and I think chamfered them, stopped the actual solid edges.
Yeah,
which was prone to light leaks.
So this would be brass, and do you know what the wood is?
Yes, mahogany.
Mahogany.
Yeah.
Mahogany and brass.
Yeah.
Classic. And a Great. Okay.
Then we're going to the film. So I would hazard a guess. I would say that probably the first major landmark came 4 years later, after AP was launched in 1888, when George Eastman is an American. He was an inventor, he was a businessman, he was an entrepreneur, and he introduced a camera which he called the Kodak. And it was the first time that name had been used. There's a lot of speculation earlier on about why he chose the name Kodak. People thought perhaps it's an acronym for something, stands for something. I even heard it said it was the name the shutter. It was the noise the shutter made when you went Kodak. Load of rubbish. Eastman chose a name purely for marketing purposes. He was very fond, for some reason, he put in writing, of the letter K. And he thought it was a good decisive sound, you could get from K. And he wanted a word which meant nothing in any language, basically, but could be understandable in any language. This is why he was a great marketeer. And what he saw was a hole in the market for people who had never owned a camera, but would like to own a camera, but was scared of all the controls.
I thought it was simpler than that.
That's it, exactly. And so he produced this. This particular one is a replica of the first Kodak from 1888. And the only controls it would have had would be a string to pull and tension the shutter, a button to release the shutter, and a film wind. No particular way of telling you how far to wind it. I would imagine they said must be 3 winds or something like that. I don't know. You can't open it up because it came preloaded with enough film to take 100 exposures. And after they had been taken, the whole lot went back to the Eastman Works, where they opened the camera, took the film out, processed it, printed it, loaded a new film, and sent the whole thing back to the photographer with his or her prints
Just send it off to Kodak to be broke, the whole camera.
Yeah,
then you
the
get
whole camera.
yeah.
And the whole
And
camera.
do I remember correctly that those pictures were circular as well?
The originals with this one were 3.5 inches. So the reason for that is it had a mask inside, and the definition of the lens wasn't good enough for the edges. So you put a circular mask in it so that you got maximum sharpness
Right.
in the image that you were looking at.
Great for when it made coasters.
Yes. So that was the first roll film camera, and really the first snapshot,
And called the Kodak.
and just called the Kodak. After that,
And it's
1888.
1888.
That is so there. So
I'll give it a bit of a whine.
yeah. So yeah, simplest camera. But what this did, of course, was it introduced photography to a whole new market. That's what Eastman was a very good marketeer. He could find holes in the market and then plug them.
Yeah. So this was, of course, massively successful, wasn't it?
It was indeed. It was indeed. I think it cost 5 guineas.
Right.
In Britain when it was its first launch, something like that. But
I don't know whether I should ask you how much that would be in modern, but it's probably still quite expensive.
well, I mean, what was the weekly wage? About £1 a week, something like
Right.
that, for the average person. Yeah. So, I mean, at this early stage, really, it's all Kodak, because the next major landmark came in 1900 with the launch of an iconic name, the Brownie. This is the first Brownie. Now, for those out there who are a bit pedantic, I would point out that this is the second model of the first Brownie, because the first model had a back which went on the back like a shoebox.
Right, okay.
The second model had a hinged back like that. And the reason I'm saying this is because I've gone into print before now, saying this is the first model, and got letters to say.
Oh, right, okay.
But the essential idea was exactly the same. Now, it was called the Brownie. It was invented by a man whose name was Brownell, but it wasn't called the Brownie because of his name. There was a Canadian illustrator of children's comics at that time called Palmer Cox, and he invented a series of little elf-like creatures called brownies, and this was aimed very much at children. So
Okay.
the brownie. And in fact, the first box, and I would love to get one, but they're very rare, has got the little elf-like creatures all
It's
up.
on it, okay.
All the brownies.
And didn't Brownell work for Kodak?
He worked for them. He produced several different things, including. Did he produce the first? Yes, he must have done. I'll come back to that. Yes, he worked for Kodak. Whether he was full-time or a freelance, I'm not absolutely sure. But
But the Brownies become like a synonymous with early cameras, isn't it?
well, absolutely.
Well, not just early cameras, because it was used for a long time.
The problem for Kodak, of course, is because ever after that, anyone who had a box camera, whether it was made by Kodak, Agfa, anyone called it a box Brownie. Whether Kodak liked that because it was getting their name out, or whether they objected.
Like the Hoover or
it's
or
exactly like Hoover or Biro.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. I mean, I do know that some years ago, in the 1960s, when the Instamatic first came out, if you wrote about it, as I did in those days, you must always call it the Kodak Instamatic. If you just called it the Instamatic, you got a very nasty letter from the PRs at Kodak saying you must call it the Kodak Instamatic.
Right.
But by the same token, of course, when Agfa produced a similar camera, people called them Instamatics. It was a two-edged sword for Kodak. The other thing about the Brownie is it came without a viewfinder,
Okay.
but it did have a little V embossed in the leatherwork there,
Right.
so you can sort of look there and try and get
Oh,
an
really?
idea. But if you wanted to pay an extra few bob, then you've got a viewfinder just clipped on, like that. And use a waist level, not a very good viewfinder.
So it's like a right angle.
Yes, well,
Viewing.
up to waist level viewfinder.
Yeah, waist level.
Basically. So that was 1900. It took a film size called 117, I think. But the important one came a year later in 1901. Again, what we're looking at here is fairly boring box cameras, but this is the No.2 Brownie, which is just as simple to use, but the important thing about it was that it was the first camera to take 120 roll film, and of course we're still using it today, so that was quite important. There were lots of different versions.
I presume Kodak invented that film to go into that camera.
That's what they did. I mean, they were continually producing cameras with different sizes of film. I mean, if you look at the list of films around in the early days, you could fill a page with them. But 120, 127, really, not from 35, of course, were the only ones that lasted. And 127 you can still buy today. 120 you can practically buy over the counter if you know where to go. But that's, again, a very simple camera. But it is important because it was the first camera to use 120-year-old film.
Which, of course, was later adopted by Hasselblad, Rolleiflex, and all these other...
etc., etc.
Yeah.
There you are. So that's 1901. If we still stick with Kodak, we should go to 1912, I suppose. And again, they did the same thing. They produced the first camera to take 127 film. And this is the Best Pocket Kodak. What you have to remember, when they talk about Best Pocket, of course, we're talking about Americans, and Americans called what we call a waistcoat, a vest. So designed to go into your waistcoat pocket, but not the camera. It was the size of picture that it took.
Right.
And that's why there with references to the Best Pocket size. And this again was a very simple camera, which pulled out on struts like that, had various rather complicated and minute instructions for different scenes around there, etc. But it was the first camera to use 127 film.
Which is like a smaller version of 120, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. What can I say about it? Oh, one interesting thing about it is it became known as the soldier's camera. Now, when the First World War broke out, soldiers were forbidden to take cameras into battle.
Allied soldiers.
Despite the fact Kodak decided to launch this and suddenly advertise it as the soldier's camera because it was very easy to slip into a tunic pocket. So how many soldiers it got into trouble, I don't know. But
if I recall, it was the British banned soldiers from taking cameras, but the Germans, the opposite, they encouraged.
Yes,
I don't know why, but the Germans thought it was a good idea to have propaganda. Maybe, I don't know, but
absolutely.
So it was very much a. But this would have been. I presume the Germans used German cameras, and this was.
Yes, but I mean, there's not many snapshots of the First World War. That's the thing, because I'm interested in snapshot photography. It was the first war to be popularised with photography, but all by professionals. So not many amateurs.
Because of the ban on amateurs.
Absolutely. But nevertheless, Kodak continued to advertise it with pictures of soldiers using it and referring to it. Before the war, they called it something else. They just said how small and dainty it was.
I guess when the Americans came into the war, I guess they didn't know they had the same ban on.
Probably not. Possibly not. Of course, they came in a bit later, of course. As always the case. So that's 1912. Same year as this monster made a first appearance. This is a speed graphic, which was a plate camera, much like a more complicated version of the originals that we've looked at before. And this stayed in production in various forms right through to the 1950s. It became the press camera.
This was the press photographer's camera, isn't it? If you're looking at classic Hollywood black and white film noir, and the press photographer pops out of the shadows with a big flash. It's one of these, isn't it?
With a flash gun on the side, which he did,
flash bulb or something,
What this one has got on it, it's got a current rangefinder, which is quite interesting. It took a little bulb and a battery, and it worked the opposite way round to a rangefinder. When you look through a rangefinder, you have to bring the two images together.
Yeah.
What this did was it shone a beam of light through the two rangefinder windows, which you would centre on your subject and move it backwards and forwards until the two beams coincided.
Literally on the subject?
Yeah.
Right.
If you remember the Dam Busters.
I don't remember. It was a long time ago.
Those that do. In the Dam Busters film, they had to get the planes flying at exactly the right height. And they did it by having two lights on each end of the aircraft.
Right.
And going up and down until the two coincided.
Right. Okay.
So they are same sort of thing in there. So speed graphic went on forever. But
so this was this took sheets of film. Sheets of, but not glass, but sheets of
cut film.
Cut film.
Yeah. Which are.
What size was that?
This is quarter plate.
Right. Okay.
Which is in the 4 and a quarter.
Right. Okay. But later on, there were roll film versions of speed.
You would have got a roll film back for this.
Roll film back, okay.
Possibly, but they were very much. And you'd use it exactly the same way. You'd focus on there if you wanted to. Or you had a viewfinder, or you had a rangefinder. But there are the speed graphic right through.
There can't be many cameras that have such a long shelf life.
No. I mean, there were different versions, but essentially they were this. I wouldn't tell you exactly which year this particular one came from.
This American?
Yeah, it's American. Yeah. And then we can move forward again to the last of this little section, with the No.3 Autographic special, which has got a couple of landmarks about it.
This is a Kodak as well.
This is Kodak as well. In fact, everything we look at Kodak, apart from the graphic made by Graphics. This is the first camera with a rangefinder, with a coupled rangefinder. It's 1916, and the way you used it, it had like a split image rangefinder, and you used it by looking at it through here.
Okay.
So if I were to take a picture of you, I would have to turn all the way round and look through there.
Look at it sideways.
That's
okay.
right. And you get, and then you focus it like that, and you get a split image that comes together. So,
Right.
And of course, the coupled rangefinder became really popular with 35mm. So now the other thing about this is the reason why. Oh, the reason why it's called a special is because of the coupled rangefinder. The reason why it's called an autographic camera is because it had a feature on the back, which Kodak introduced in 1914. So it's also on the Best Pocket Kodak, which I showed you there. And this took a special film called Autographic film, which had the film and the backing paper, as any roll film does. Mm. But between the two, there was a layer of waxed paper. And the idea was you'd take a picture and you'd open this little trapdoor and you'd take that stylus out of there and you could write on there anything you like, you know, our holidays in 1927, whatever. And if you pressed hard enough, that would break the wax film. And then when you held it like that up to the light for a few minutes, whatever, it would expose your writing onto the film. So when it came out, on the rebate between the frames, there'd be your written notes.
Kind of like a carbon paper type thing.
Yes,
then,
yeah. So that's the first data back.
Right, okay. You could write on the film.
That's right. So Kodak introduced that in 1914, and they put it on nearly all their cameras through to about 1927. And that was it. Now that is 1916. And of course, within a few years, World War I broke out, and things began to slow down for a bit. So that's as far as we're going for this.
Okay, well that's fascinating. So this is a roundup of sort of cameras up until the First World War.
Absolutely.
First World War.
Absolutely.
So I hope you found that interesting. Do comment, tell us what you think about these cameras. If you have any interesting, any favourites or any interesting anecdotes of this additional information you want to share, do that. Do like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel, and don't miss the next video where we talk about cameras from between the wars, from the end of the First World War up until the Second World War.
Absolutely. That's what
okay, thank you.
Thank you.